It was a quiet Friday evening. My daughter Lily was only 10 years old. She had always been an independent, brave little girl. My wife and I had to attend a dinner party that night, so we decided to leave Lily home alone for the first time. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away. We trusted her to be safe. "Call us if you need anything, okay?" I told her before we left. Lily nodded with a smile, waving as we walked out the door. The house was peaceful, and Lily enjoyed having it all to herself. She curled up on the couch, watching her favorite cartoons. Everything seemed fine until the power went out. Suddenly, the house was plunged into darkness. The TV turned off with a loud pop, and the only sound was the wind howling outside. Lily stood up and looked around, her heart beating faster. She reached for her phone to call us, but the battery had died. She tried the light switch, but nothing worked. She walked over to the window, hoping to see lights from the other houses on the street, but they were all dark too. A blackout, she thought, trying to stay calm. But then, she heard it. A soft knock on the front door. Lily froze. Who could be knocking at this hour? She knew better than to open the door, so she stayed where she was, holding her breath. The knocking stopped for a moment, and she sighed in relief. Maybe it was just the wind. But then it started again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Her heart pounded in her chest. She backed away from the door, trying to think of what to do. There was no one else in the house, no one to help her. The knocking stopped again, and the house fell silent. But just as she turned to walk back to the living room, she heard something even worse. A voice. "Lily." It was a whisper, soft but clear. "Lily, open the door." Lily's blood ran cold. How did they know her name? She ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, her hands shaking. She pressed her back against the wall, listening, but the voice had stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, as if something was waiting. She tiptoed to the front door and looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. The street outside was empty, and the darkness seemed to press against the windows. Then, from behind her, she heard it again. "Lily." Her heart almost stopped. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside the house. Lily turned slowly, clutching the knife, her eyes wide with fear. She scanned the dark living room, but she couldn't see anything. The shadows seemed to shift and move, and she had the terrible feeling that she wasn't alone. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. Something was moving in her room. Lily ran to the stairs, knife still in hand, trying to be brave. She knew she had to see what it was, even though every part of her wanted to run outside and never look back. She reached the top of the stairs and slowly pushed her bedroom door open. The room was dark, but she could see a figure standing by her bed. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in the shadows. The air in the room was cold, freezing, and Lily could see her breath in front of her. The figure turned to face her. "Lily," it whispered. Lily screamed and ran down the stairs, throwing the door open and running outside into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached the dinner party, tears streaming down her face. When we got back home, we found the front door wide open, the lights back on. Everything looked normal, but Lily refused to go back inside. She said there was something in the house, something that knew her name. To this day, she won't talk about what she saw in her room that night, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I think I hear it too. Knock, knock, knock. It was a cold, quiet night, and Sarah was home alone for the weekend. Her parents had gone out of town, leaving her in charge of the house. At first, she enjoyed the freedom. She made some popcorn, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch to watch a horror movie. The house was old, but Sarah didn't mind. She had lived there her entire life and knew every creaky floorboard and drafty window. As she watched the movie, the wind howled outside, and tree branches tapped against the windows, casting shadows that flickered in the dim light of the television. Sarah wasn't scared, though. She loved horror movies, and being alone didn't bother her. At least, not at first. About halfway through the movie, Sarah heard something strange. Soft footsteps coming from upstairs. She paused the movie and listened. holding her breath. For a moment, there was silence. She let out a nervous laugh, convincing herself it was nothing more than the old house settling. But just as she pressed play to resume the movie, the footsteps came again, louder this time. Sarah's heart started to race. She grabbed her phone and checked the time, 11:15 p.m. She was certain she was alone in the house, but now she wasn't so sure. She quickly sent a text to her best friend, Emily. "I think there's someone in the house," Emily replied almost instantly. "You're probably just imagining things. You're watching a scary movie after all." Sarah wanted to believe that, but the sound of footsteps echoed through her mind. She decided to check it out. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, she cautiously made her way up the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, making the silence feel even heavier. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was pitch black. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly ajar, which was strange because she knew she hadn't been in there. With her flashlight shaking in her hand, she pushed the door open and looked inside. The room was empty, just as it should be. As she was about to turn and go back downstairs, Sarah heard something else. This time, a faint whispering. It was coming from above her. She froze, eyes widening as she realized the sound was coming from the attic. The attic door, which was usually shut tight, was now slightly open. Her stomach dropped, and she felt her pulse quicken. She debated whether to check it out or run, but her curiosity got the better of her. Slowly, she climbed the narrow attic stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as she reached the top, and the whispering became clearer, though she couldn't make out the words. Shining her flashlight around, she saw the usual clutter of old boxes and dusty furniture. Everything seemed still, except for an old rocking chair in the corner, gently rocking back and forth. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. No one was sitting in it, but the chair moved as if someone had just been there. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The rocking chair stilled. Silence filled the attic, thick and unsettling. She turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. But just as she reached the attic stairs, a cold gust of air brushed against the back of her neck. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam shaking wildly, but there was nothing there. She bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her panic, and slammed the attic door shut. Her breathing was ragged, and her mind raced. What had she just seen? What was happening? As she stood there, trying to calm herself, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging her into complete darkness. The only light now was the faint glow from her phone. She fumbled with it, trying to dial Emily, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Sarah's heart raced even faster as she turned to run to the windows, hoping to escape. But before she could take another step, she heard footsteps again, this time coming from the stairs behind her. She froze. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer. She turned her flashlight towards the stairs, but no one was there. She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. That's when she saw it. Written in the dust on the wall, clear as day, were 3 chilling words. "You're not alone." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and her hands began to shake. The room suddenly felt colder, almost freezing, and then she heard it. A low, deep chuckle echoing from somewhere in the house. She turned to run, but the darkness seemed to close in on her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, right behind her. After that night, Sarah was never seen again. The house remained empty, but neighbors sometimes reported strange sounds, footsteps, whispers, and the occasional laughter, echoing from inside. It was a late autumn evening, and the last leaves whispered in the crisp breeze as Emily, a 22-year-old art student, arrived at her sleek, modern house nestled in a newly developed suburb. She had just said goodbye to her friends after a small dinner party. The house, with its large glass windows and minimalist design, felt particularly isolated tonight, surrounded by empty lots awaiting future homes. Emily was alone, her parents away on a business trip, and her younger brother at a sleepover. She loved the spaciousness of her house, But tonight, the vast open-plan layout seemed to amplify every little sound, turning the soft closing of a door into a sharp snap. As she settled in the living room, a strange unease took hold of her. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. She tried watching TV to drown out the silence, but the flickering images couldn't dispel the growing feeling that she was being watched. Deciding she needed sleep, Emily headed upstairs to her bedroom, her steps light against the polished concrete floor. The unease followed her, crawling up her spine. As she prepared for bed, the lights flickered, casting her shadow against the wall like a specter. In bed, Emily struggled to fall asleep, her mind alert to every sound. A sudden crash downstairs jolted her awake. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone. No signal. The Wi-Fi was down too. Frightened, but needing to know what happened, she tiptoed down the stairs, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The living room was a mess. A chair was overturned and her art supplies were scattered across the floor as if swept away by a gust of wind. Yet, all the windows were closed, the house sealed tight against the night. As she bent to pick up a scattered paintbrush, a cold whisper brushed her ear. "Leave now." Frozen with fear, Emily turned slowly. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, coalescing into a dark, humanoid shape. She screamed, throwing the brush at the shadow, but it passed right through and clattered harmlessly to the floor. The shape advanced, and as it did, the temperature plummeted, the breath turning visible in front of her face. Emily backed away, stumbling over the fallen chair, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. She made a break for the front door, but as she ran, her vision blurred, her steps faltered, and darkness edged her sight. She collapsed, her body mere feet from the door, her hands stretched out toward the threshold. The last thing Emily saw was the shadow looming over her, and then everything went black. The next morning, a neighbor out for a jog noticed the front door ajar. Inside, they found Emily, cold and lifeless, her open eyes staring at a destiny she could not escape. The police found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of another presence in the house. It was as if the shadows themselves had claimed her. From that day on, the house stood vacant, a modern shell that locals hurried past, whispering about the young girl who had died alone, surrounded by the shadows that had made the sleek glass and concrete their home. In the heart of a dense forest, a group of old college friends reunited for their annual camping trip. This year, they had chosen an isolated spot near a rumored haunted lake, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to watch over them. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and a hint of apprehension about camping near such a place. As the first night enveloped the forest, the friends gathered around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They shared laughs and stories of the past, but as the night deepened, an unsettling silence crept over them. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, were eerily absent. Jake, always the thrill-seeker of the group, proposed a midnight stroll around the lake. Despite some hesitations, the allure of adventure proved too tempting. Armed with flashlights and a mix of courage and fear, they set off into the dark woods. As they neared the lake, a dense fog began to roll over the surface of the water, and the temperature dropped sharply. The beam of their flashlights barely penetrated the thick mist. Suddenly, Ellie, who was leading the group, stopped dead in her tracks. Her light had caught something unusual, a small old rowboat, gently bobbing in the water with no one inside. Curiosity overcame their fear, and they decided to investigate. As they approached the boat, they heard a faint whispering sound, like voices murmuring from the depths of the lake. The whispers grew louder, and the group could distinctly hear their names being called, beckoning them closer. Fascinated and terrified, they watched as the boat seemed to move closer to the shore on its own. Without warning, Jake stepped into the water, drawn by the voices. His friends shouted for him to come back, but he seemed entranced, moving deeper into the lake. In a frantic effort to save him, two of the friends waded into the water after him. But just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped, and the fog lifted. Jake was nowhere to be seen. The lake had swallowed him up without a trace. The remaining friends scrambled back to the campsite, their minds reeling from the night's events. Dawn brought no comfort, only the stark realization that Jake was gone. They notified the authorities, but searches turned up nothing. No trace of Jake, nor any sign of the mysterious rowboat was ever found. The friends left the forest with heavy hearts, their annual reunions forever marked by the haunting loss. They never returned to the haunted lake, and they never spoke of that night again, each carrying their own silent burden of the chilling whispers that had called them into the dark waters. It was supposed to be the perfect end to a summer. The old beach house, forgotten by time and buried in the encroaching dunes, had always been our secret haven. This time, I ventured alone, needing the solitude after a tumultuous year. The house was just as I remembered: weathered shingles, salt-stained windows, and the relentless sea breeze that seemed to carry whispers from the deep. As dusk crept along the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of red and purple, an unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The beach, usually a comforting presence, felt different that evening. The waves crashed with more fury, and the wind howled like mourning spirits. After a restless attempt at reading, I decided a walk along the shore might settle my nerves. The beach was desolate. The only footprints in the sand were mine, freshly imprinted and solitary. But as I walked, a strange phenomenon caught my eye. A second set of footprints appeared alongside mine, as though someone was walking beside me, unseen. The logical part of my brain reasoned it must be a trick of the light or remnants of someone else's earlier passage, but the depth and freshness of the print suggested otherwise. Each step I took, the accompanying set matched perfectly, never more than a stride away. My heart raced, and the back of my neck prickled with dread. Turning back to the house, the footprints continued to follow. By the time I reached the back door, I was in a near panic, slamming and locking the door behind me. Peering out the salt-scratched window, I saw that the footprints stopped at the edge of the porch, as if whatever accompanied me had waited there. I retreated upstairs to the supposed safety of my room, the house creaking around me. Trying to calm my nerves, I reminded myself that the isolation could play tricks on one's mind. But as darkness swallowed the light, the sound of footsteps emerged, this time from the attic above. Thump, thump, thump. The steady pace was deliberate, measured, as if someone was searching for something, or someone. The idea of someone hiding in the house was ludicrous, yet the fear that gripped me was palpable. I grabbed the old iron poker from beside the fireplace for protection, my hands trembling. As I stood, frozen in fear, the footsteps ceased and a cold silence filled the house. Then, a new sound began, scratching against the attic floor, growing louder, more frantic. In a moment of terror-fueled bravery, I flung open the door to the attic, the poker raised high. Nothing but old boxes and dust greeted me, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the wooden floor. Just as I began to breathe a sigh of relief, a cold gust of wind blasted through an open window, carrying with it a tattered piece of paper that fluttered directly into my hands. It was a photograph, old and faded, but unmistakably a picture of me, standing by the shore. Except in the photo, a shadowy figure stood next to me, its face blurred and indistinct. Dropping the photo in horror, I raced from the house, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I drove away, one last glance in the rearview mirror showed the silhouette of a figure standing in the attic window, watching me flee. The beach house remains empty now, and I've never returned. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of footsteps outside my door, and I wonder if something from that house followed me home. It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of Willow Creek. Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. This house, left to her by her late grandmother, was reputed among the locals to be haunted. But Sarah, a pragmatic software developer, didn't believe in ghost stories. As the wind howled and lightning streaked across the sky, Sarah settled in for the night. She lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, the warm glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Curling up with a book, she tried to ignore the creaks and groans of the old house settling around her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house. Startled, Sarah jumped up and looked around. A picture frame had fallen from the wall. She picked it up and saw it was a photo of her grandmother, taken in this very house. As she stared at the photo, the lights flickered and then died, plunging her into darkness. The storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, its winds whipping against the house. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She fumbled for a flashlight and turned it on, its beam unsteady in her trembling hand. Deciding to check the circuit breaker, she moved through the house, her way lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. The air grew inexplicably cold as she reached the basement door. She hesitated, her instinct screaming for her to turn back, but she pushed on, opening the door. The old wooden stairs creaked ominously under her weight as she descended into the basement. It was cluttered with old furniture and boxes filled with her grandmother's belongings. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she approached the circuit breaker, and then it went out completely, enveloping her in darkness. Panicking, she tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it was no use. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath in the cold air. A feeling of dread washed over her as she heard a whisper, barely audible over the howl of the storm. "Leave." Terrified, Sarah ran back towards the stairs, but the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. She screamed, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. As she turned, lightning illuminated the house, and she saw the silhouette of a figure at the end of the hallway. The figure was an old woman, dressed in a tattered gown, her eyes hollow and dark. She pointed at Sarah, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. Sarah, heart pounding, backed away slowly. The lights flickered back on, and the figure vanished. Heart still racing, Sarah dashed upstairs, locking herself in her bedroom. She stayed awake all night, lights blazing, every small sound making her jump. As dawn broke, she packed her things and left the house, never to return. She realized that some houses are better left alone, especially those that whisper warnings in the storms. Sarah later learned that her grandmother had always been sensitive to the paranormal, something she'd never believed until that night. The town's history revealed that the house had been built on the site of an old asylum, explaining perhaps the restless spirits. Sarah's skepticism had turned into a cautious respect for the unknown, and she decided never to scoff at ghost stories again. The experience had left her with a lingering fear of storms, a reminder of that night when the boundary between the living and the dead had seemed all too thin. Ever since the Harrisons moved in next door, things have been off. At first, they seemed like the ideal neighbors, friendly, always smiling, and eager to help with community events. But then, the screams started. At first, I thought it was just their kids playing too rough. But as the weeks went by, the screams became more frequent and more terrifying. One night, the screams jolted me awake. They were loud, desperate, filled with a kind of fear that makes your blood run cold. I lay there, heart pounding, debating whether to call the police. But just as I reached for my phone, the screams stopped abruptly. Everything went silent. Too silent. The next morning, I decided to pay the Harrisons a visit. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I needed to know everything was okay. I walked next door and knocked. Mrs. Harrison opened the door, her face pale, a forced smile plastered on her lips. Behind her, I could see Mr. Harrison in the living room, sitting perfectly still, staring right at me with an unnerving intensity. I asked if everything was okay, mentioning the screams from last night. Mrs. Harrison laughed, a little too loudly, and assured me everything was fine. "Just watching a scary movie," she said. But her eyes, wide and darting, told a different story. That evening, I kept watch. The sun set, and the house next door seemed unusually quiet. As darkness enveloped our street, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Figures, 4 of them, dressed in dark robes, entered the Harrisons' house. None of them were the Harrisons. Hours later, the screams started again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called the police. When they arrived, the house was silent once more. They knocked, waited, and finally forced their way in when there was no response. I watched from my window, heart in my throat. The officers emerged a long time later, their faces grim. They found the Harrisons in the basement, bound and gagged. The house was otherwise empty, no sign of the robed figures. The police said it looked like some sort of ritual had been interrupted. The Harrisons were rushed to the hospital, alive but traumatized. The next day, a for sale sign popped up on their lawn. They left without saying goodbye, leaving behind more questions than answers. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see figures in dark robes walking down our street, heading towards where the Harrisons used to live. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I still hear screams, echoes of terror that linger in the air. In the remote stretches of the Pine Barrens, a group of friends set out for a weekend of camping, eager to escape the hustle of city life. The campsite was secluded, encircled by dense forests and under a canopy of ancient pines that whispered with the slightest breeze. As night fell on their first day, the group gathered around the campfire, their faces flickering in the light. They laughed and shared stories, but as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to settle over them. The woods seemed unnaturally silent, devoid of the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures. Suddenly, the fire sputtered as a chilling gust swept through the campsite. The temperature dropped sharply, and the group huddled closer, their mirth replaced by apprehension. That's when Jenna, one of the campers, noticed something odd about the shadows cast by the fire. They seemed to move independently of their sources, twisting and writhing against the trunks of the pines. Pointing it out, she whispered, "Do you see that? The shadows are wrong." Her friends looked, and what they saw chilled them to the bone. The shadows were indeed moving, creeping slowly towards their circle. Panic set in, but Mark, trying to be rational, insisted it must be a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the fire. To prove his point, he walked towards one of the moving shadows, his own silhouette merging with it. But as he did, his laughter stopped abruptly, swallowed by a sudden darkness. He didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. In a blink, he was gone, as if the shadow had devoured him. Terrified, the rest of the group backed away, their eyes wide with horror. They watched as the shadows retreated to the edge of the firelight, quivering as if alive. No one dared to speak. The fire now seemed their only protection, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Without a word, they agreed to keep the fire burning bright, feeding it continuously throughout the night. They took turns watching, too afraid to sleep, jumping at every crack and rustle in the woods. As dawn broke, the shadows receded with the darkness, and the forest sounds returned. Exhausted and shaken, the friends packed up their camp in silence. What had happened to Mark remained unspoken, a question none dared to answer. They left the Pine Barrens as quickly as they could, the morning light doing little to warm them or ease their fears. The woods had changed for them, no longer a place of refuge but a reminder of their fragility and the darkness that awaited in the unwatched corners of the world. They never returned to the forest, and they never found Mark. His disappearance remained a mystery, as did the true nature of the shadows that haunted their campsite that fateful night. The forgotten stretches of Cape Hollow, a place shrouded in fog and local legends, I found the remnants of an abandoned village by the beach. My curiosity as a historian drew me to this eerie site, eager to unearth stories hidden beneath layers of time and sand. The village, once a bustling seaside community, had been deserted following a mysterious catastrophe in the early 1900s, leaving it a shell of broken homes and ghostly whispers. As I wandered through the dilapidated structures, the ocean's roar a constant backdrop, I felt a creeping unease. The air was thick with salt and decay, and every creak and moan of the wind through the ruined buildings seemed to carry voices of the past. It was as if the village itself was alive, watching me. Compelled by an unexplainable pull, I ventured toward the coastline where the ruins met the sand. There, jutting out from a particularly dense fog bank, was the old lighthouse, its once guiding light now dark, a silent sentinel overlooking the waves. Drawn to its isolation, I made my way through the swirling mist, the ground beneath my feet becoming increasingly soggy and difficult to navigate. Reaching the lighthouse, I noticed that despite its age and neglect, the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of mold and rust. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I started up the spiral staircase, my hand trailing along the peeling wall paint. At the top, the view was breathtakingly ominous. The ocean stretched endlessly, its dark waves crashing against the shore with relentless force. But it was not the view that caught my breath. It was the sound. From below, a soft, sorrowful singing drifted up the stairwell, a melody so haunting it seemed woven from the very mist. Frozen by a mix of fear and fascination, I listened as the song grew louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, full of longing and despair, mourning something lost to the sea. My heart pounded as I crept back down the stairs, the compulsion to find the source of this lament overwhelming my better judgment. The singing led me outside, back into the fog, which now seemed to glow with an unnatural light. Following the sound, I found myself at the water's edge, where the figure of a woman appeared in the mist. Her back was to me, her dress a tattered relic swaying in the wind. She continued to sing, her voice blending with the ocean's roar. I called out, asking who she was, what she mourned. She turned slowly, her face obscured by strands of wet hair in the thick fog. As our eyes met, I saw her grief, her eyes hollow, endless like the sea. Her song was a curse, she explained, bound to the coastline, a lament for her husband, taken by the ocean's depths. Each note was a plea for his return, a plea that had never been answered. The realization of her sorrow, her eternal weight, chilled me to the core. I stumbled back, the urge to escape overwhelming. As I ran, her song echoed in my ears, a melody that I knew would haunt me forever. I left Cape Hollow behind that day, but the ghostly song of the lighthouse widow never left me. It whispers to me in the quiet moments, a sorrowful reminder of the sea's relentless memory. I moved into the old Whitmore house on Elm Street about 3 months ago. It was a quiet neighborhood, or so it seemed. The house next door had been vacant for years, according to the local gossip. But soon after I settled in, strange things began to happen. It started with noises. Every night, around midnight, I'd hear footsteps in the house next door. They were slow, deliberate, like someone with a heavy, dragging gait. At first, I thought perhaps someone had finally moved in. But a peek through my bedroom window always confirmed the house remained dark, the windows like dead eyes watching. One night, the footsteps stopped right by our adjoining wall. Then, tapping. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through my quiet room, making my heart race. Curiosity mixed with fear, I knocked back. Silence. Then, a scrape, like a chair dragging across the floor, and the footsteps resumed, fading away. The incidents grew more frequent. Lights would flicker in my house. My dog would growl at corners and the cold spots. They'd appear out of nowhere, leaving goosebumps on my arms. One evening, I saw her, an old woman, in the upstairs window of the house next door. She was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. She stared right at me, and I felt a chill that went deeper than bone. The next day, I asked around. No one had lived in that house for over a decade since Mrs. Whitmore died. They found her in that very upstairs room, sitting in her rocking chair, overlooking my now bedroom window. Her death was ruled natural, but rumors swirled about the old woman's obsession with the occult, her pact with something unholy for eternal vigilance over her property. That night, the tapping returned, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I went over. The front door was unlocked, creaking open at my touch. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with dust and decay. I made my way upstairs, each step groaning under my weight. The door to the upstairs room was ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, but there she was, in the rocking chair, facing the window. Her ghostly figure turned to me, her face contorting in rage or warning. I couldn't tell which. I ran, out of the house, back to safety. But every night since, I feel her watching, and the tapping. It never really stops. Sometimes I wonder if she wants something from me, or perhaps she's warning me of something far more sinister lurking in our quiet neighborhood. Claire had always loved her sleek, high-rise apartment in the city center. It boasted floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the urban skyline. Tonight, however, as a storm gathered, casting the city in a sinister light, her beloved view seemed more menacing than ever. As the clock struck midnight, the power flickered and went out, leaving Claire in darkness, the cityscape her only light source, its eerie glow illuminating her apartment in haunting shades of blue and gray. The wind howled against the glass, making the whole apartment groan under its force. Attempting to calm her nerves, Claire lit some candles and placed them around the living room. Their flicker created dancing shadows on the walls, which twisted and turned as if alive. She tried to settle down with a book, but the sense of unease was palpable, as if the storm outside had seeped into her home. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room. Claire froze. The windows were sealed. There should be no draft. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, and that's when she noticed the balcony door slightly ajar, swaying gently. With a deep breath, she walked over to close it, but stopped dead in her tracks. The reflection in the glass didn't show her alone. Behind her stood a figure, draped in dark, wet clothes, hair plastered to its face, obscuring its features but for the eyes, which burned a fierce, unnatural red. Claire spun around, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. Heart pounding, she rushed to slam the door shut and lock it. As she turned back, the room seemed darker than before. The candlelight too dim, the shadows too deep. She decided to call her friend, but her phone was dead, even though she had charged it just before the storm. A growing terror took root in her heart. She was not alone. The air grew colder, and her breath formed mist in front of her. Whispers filled the apartment, words indistinguishable, swirling around her, louder and louder, until they were almost deafening. Claire covered her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, urging her to look out the window. Against her better judgment, she approached the window, peering out into the storm. Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, she saw figures on the street below, all looking up at her, their eyes red as the figure behind her. She screamed, backing away from the window, stumbling over a candle and sending it crashing to the floor. The fire caught quickly on a curtain, and in seconds, the apartment was ablaze. Trapped and overcome with smoke, Claire collapsed, the last thing she saw being the figure at her balcony door, watching her as the flames engulfed everything around her. Her building stood tall the next morning, untouched by fire, her apartment pristine as if nothing had happened. No one in the building had seen or smelled smoke. But Claire was gone. Her disappearance a mystery, her name added to the list of unexplained vanishings in the city's heart. The apartment remained vacant, the locals whispering of the cursed high-rise, where the storm brings more than just wind and rain. It brings the forgotten back, if only for one night. On the edge of a dense forest in Oregon, a group of friends decided to camp near an old abandoned logging camp. The camp was said to be cursed by the locals, with stories of loggers who vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Despite the ominous warnings, the friends, fueled by curiosity and a love for the supernatural, pitched their tents as dusk fell, the forest enveloping them in its shadowy embrace. As they settled in, the crackle of the campfire blended with the rustling of leaves. Eric, the group's unofficial storyteller, began recounting the tales of the disappeared loggers, their spirits rumored to still wander the forest, searching for the way back to their earthly lives. The group listened, their eyes wide, as the wind seemed to carry whispers of names and distant cries for help. Later that night, after the stories had set a chill upon them, Mia suggested they use a spirit board to contact the spirits of the loggers. Skeptical but intrigued, they gathered around, placing their fingers lightly on the planchette. At first, nothing happened, and some chuckled nervously, ready to dismiss the idea. But as the fire dwindled, the planchette jerked to life, moving swiftly across the board, spelling out, "Leave now!" The air grew thick, and a fog rolled in from the depths of the forest, chilling them to the bone. Laughing it off, they decided to pack up the board and settle in for the night. However, Sarah, one of the group, was visibly shaken, insisting she could hear footsteps circling their campsite. The others assured her it was just animals, perhaps curious deer, but the unease had settled deep within them all. Unable to sleep, Sarah stepped out of her tent for some air, the fog now so dense she could barely see the trees surrounding their camp. The others heard her tent unzip, but paid no mind until they heard a sharp, panicked scream cut through the night. Rushing out, they found Sarah's tent empty, her footprints leading into the thick fog towards the old logging camp. Frantically, they followed, calling her name into the obscured night. As they approached the ruins of the logging camp, the fog began to dissipate, revealing the old, decrepit machinery and fallen logs. But of Sarah, there was no sign. Her footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The night passed in a blur of fear and confusion as they searched the area, but as dawn broke, it became clear that Sarah was gone. Authorities were notified, and a search was conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. The group left the forest heartbroken and bewildered, the echoes of the spirit board's warning haunting them. The forest remained a place of mystery, its secrets and spirits hidden beneath the thick canopy, and Sarah's disappearance another tragic tale whispered among the towering trees. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a group of friends set up camp for a weekend of hiking and relaxation. The area was known for its breathtaking views and abandoned coal mines, which, according to local lore, were haunted by the spirits of miners who perished in collapses long ago. The first day passed with laughter and stories, as the group trekked through the woods, exploring the rugged beauty of the mountains. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, the glow of the flames casting long shadows among the trees. Curiosity about the haunted mines grew as the night deepened, fueled by the eerie howling of the wind through the trees. Emboldened by the spirit of adventure, and perhaps a few drinks, Tom, the most daring of the group, proposed a midnight hike to the nearest mine entrance, which was rumored to be particularly active with paranormal sightings. With flashlights in hand and a mix of excitement and fear, the group made their way to the old mine, its entrance marked by a rusted, creaking sign warning of danger. The air grew colder as they approached, and an unsettling mist seemed to rise from the ground, enveloping their feet. Standing at the entrance, the group hesitated. The mine's dark maw loomed before them, an invitation to the unknown. Tom, with a mix of bravado and curiosity, stepped forward, his flashlight piercing the darkness. The others reluctantly followed, their lights flickering along the damp, rocky walls. As they ventured deeper, the air thickened, and a faint echo of pickaxes against stone could be heard. The sounds of the long-dead miners seemed to draw them further into the labyrinth of tunnels. Suddenly, Tom's flashlight flickered and went out. Panic ensued as the group tried to find him in the darkness, their voices echoing off the mine walls. After a tense few minutes, Tom's light came back on, but he was nowhere to be seen. His flashlight lay on the ground, casting an eerie beam into the empty darkness. The group called out for him, their voices desperate, but only the sound of their own echoes returned. Fearing the worst, they hurried back to the surface, the weight of the mountain pressing down upon them. When they reached the entrance, they realized that the mist had thickened, obscuring their path back to the campsite. Lost and frightened, they wandered until dawn, when the mist finally lifted, revealing the path home. Authorities were called, and a search was launched, but no trace of Tom was ever found. His disappearance remained a mystery, attributed by some to the spirits of the mine, claimed as one of their own. The group never returned to the mountains, and the haunted mines were left undisturbed, shrouded in their ghostly mist, guarding their secrets and lost souls in the depths below. I never believed the local tales of whispering shores, that is, until the night I was left with no choice. The beach, named for the soft, incessant murmurs that travelers claim to hear when the sun set, had always seemed an ordinary stretch of sand to me. That perception shattered on a moonless night when I, driven by a blend of skepticism and bravado, decided to camp there alone. The day passed without incident, and as dusk settled, so did a dense, choking fog. Setting up my tent near the edge where the sand met the rocky coastline, I began to hear it, the faint, eerie whispering that had given the beach its name. At first, it was like the sighing of the wind, but as darkness deepened, the whispers grew more distinct, more desperate. I tried to convince myself it was just the sound of the tide dragging over loose pebbles, or the call of distant night birds. But then, the whispers morphed into discernible words. "Leave. Go back," they said, over and over, in a chilling, rhythmic cadence. Unease morphed into fear, yet my feet remained planted, as if the sand itself had taken hold. That's when the temperature plummeted, and the real horror began. From the mist, shapes started to materialize. Dark, fluid forms that seemed both part of the fog and distinct from it. They slithered and crawled toward the shore, their forms gaining solidity with every whisper that reached my ears. Frozen in place, I watched as one of the figures became clear. A woman, her skin pale and eyes hollow, clothes tattered and wet, clinging to her body as if she had just emerged from the sea. She stopped at the water's edge, turning her blank gaze upon me. Her mouth moved in sync with the whispers, a silent summoning. I felt an inexplicable pull toward her, my body moving against my will. As I stepped closer, the sand beneath my feet felt like the touch of cold hands, dragging me down. Panic surged through me, and I tried to pull away, but the grip was relentless. The woman's whispers became screams, piercing the night as she stretched her arms out toward me. The other shapes converged, surrounding me, their whispers turning into a cacophony of cries and moans. In a desperate act, I tore off my shoes, the sudden release allowing me to stumble backward toward my tent. Grabbing a flare gun from my pack, I fired it into the air. The bright, burning light shattered the night, and the figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into the mist as if burned away by the flare's brilliance. I didn't stop to watch them vanish. I ran, not stopping until I reached my car parked far from the beach. As I drove away, the whispers faded but never completely silenced, a haunting melody that follows me in my dreams. I know now that whispering shores hold secrets meant to be left undiscovered, and the voices in the fog are not just warning. They are a lure, calling to the souls brave or foolish enough to listen. The rhythmic crash of ocean waves had always been my lullaby, living by the secluded stretch of coastline that housed the ancient weathered homes of Cliffside Lane. The house next door, once occupied by old Mrs. Carmichael, had been a particular curiosity, with its overgrown garden and stories of maritime glory days long past. After her peaceful passing, the house sat empty, windows staring like hollow eyes, until the night the Vanberrys arrived. The moving truck appeared during a dense, creeping fog that seemed to swallow the sounds of the sea. The Vanberrys, a couple shrouded in as much mystery as the fog itself, brought with them an air of unease. They rarely ventured out, and when they did, their presence was spectral, barely noticeable, their features obscured beneath wide-brimmed hats and heavy coats. Curiosity and a sense of neighborly duty compelled me to attempt an introduction. However, my knock was met with a fleeting glimpse of Mr. Vanberry, his eyes sharp and penetrating, his mouth set in a thin line, before the door swiftly closed. That night, and every night thereafter, a haunting organ melody played from their home at precisely midnight. The music, discordant and melancholy, seemed not just to drift but to seep through the very walls of my home, disturbing my sleep and setting my nerves on edge. One restless night, drawn by a mix of fear and intrigue, I found myself outside their home, the melody pulling me like a siren song. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open, the old wood groaning under my touch, and stepped into a dimly lit foyer that smelled of salt and something faintly metallic. I followed the eerie music down a narrow hallway, the walls adorned with maritime relics that seemed to watch me pass. The haunting notes led me to a back room where an antique organ sat under a dusty chandelier, its keys moving independently as if compelled by unseen hands. But it was the room's center that halted my steps and sent a chill through my core. A large cylindrical tank, filled with dark, swirling water, dominated the space. As I approached, the water calmed, and within it, I saw a figure. A woman. Her skin ghostly pale and eyes closed as if in deep slumber. Her long hair floated around her, and her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering secrets to the deep. Mesmerized, I watched as her eyes fluttered open, revealing orbs as black as the abyssal ocean. The room seemed to grow colder, the organ music louder and more insistent. Panic surged within me, and I stumbled backward, my gaze never leaving the figure in the tank. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the music crescendoed into a deafening pitch. I fled the house, the music echoing in my ears, and didn't stop until I was safely inside my own home. I called the police, my voice shaking as I recounted what I had seen. When the authorities arrived, they found the house silent and abandoned. There was no sign of the organ, the tank, or the Vanberries. The only evidence that someone had been there at all was a set of wet footprints leading from the house to the cliff's edge, where they disappeared. The house next door stands empty still, its mysteries unexplained and perhaps better left undiscovered. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the fog rolls in thick and the sea whispers, I hear the faint strains of an organ playing from the abandoned house, and I wonder if the Vanberries ever truly left, or if they had ever been human at all.